Hello, everybody. My name is Max Briggs. I'm the Shape Value Proposition Lead for NASA's SBIR program. And what that means is that I'm in charge of trying to figure out for the SBIR program how we can more effectively engage with communities that we think we could do a better job engaging with. And so one of the communities that we are actively trying to do a better job with is the community of entrepreneurs. And the community of entrepreneurs is the focus of the SBIR Ignite solicitation, which you guys are here to learn more about. So I'd like to thank you all for tuning in today so I can talk to you about this new opportunity and what differentiates it from the traditional SBIR solicitation. Just to let you know what to expect for the next half an hour or so, I'm not going to be presenting charts. I'm just going to be talking to you guys about the Ignite solicitation, kind of where it fits in NASA's strategy and how it's differentiated from other things within SBIR. I'm going to talk about that for a little while. And then when I'm done, we're going to go to questions from the audience, which should be put into the chat. And those questions will be curated by one of our SBIR Ignite team members, Jen Consalvo. So I want to start off just by talking about a kind of simple question, which is why does NASA care about entrepreneurs? And so it may seem obvious in some other agencies, but for an agency that focuses on very specific missions, very difficult missions, and typically very expensive missions that don't necessarily have large commercial markets, it's a question that's important, right? So if we are trying to address, trying to put astronauts on Mars, the question is, if that's what we're trying to do, then why would we be asking somebody who's, there's not a large commercial market there. So why would we be asking people who are trying to address commercial markets to help us? Why should we fund those people? That has been, fairly controversial for some period of time. But it's becoming less and less controversial because, emerging aerospace markets, emerging aeronautics markets, and especially activity in space and business models in space are becoming more and more pervasive. As launch costs come down and business models come forward as more and more viable, more and more of the activity that we actually, that is going on in space is done for the commercial sector, not done for NASA. NASA hasn't been the largest player in space for a very long time. So if NASA wants to be an effective not only user of innovations in space, but also a cultivator of innovations in space, we really have to get smarter about how we engage entrepreneurs who are really trying to engage a commercial market for which NASA may be a customer, but isn't going to be the primary customer. And so I really think that we're here at a time where in the past, in order to have a technology that was relevant to NASA, that was also commercially relevant, that you had to kind of have a coincidence. You had to have Teflon, or you have to have some high temperature material that you have to use on Venus that happens to also be usable on in a turbine here on Earth. And we don't necessarily need that anymore, because as more and more commercial activity goes on in space, more and more of the things that are developed for a NASA use case can actually be used in its intended NASA use case for a commercial entity. So you see things like rad-hard electronics or deployable solar arrays, things that were once considered to be NASA niche technologies actually end up becoming things that are crucial for business models in space. And likewise, as NASA starts to go further and further away from Earth and want to stay at locations for longer and longer periods of time, it's insufficient for us to say, I want to get somebody to the moon and bring them back safely. We have to figure out how to go to a place, live an effective and productive life, and that involves all kinds of things. There are things like agriculture and remote health monitoring and supply chain and logistics. How do you get supplies to and from a location on a recurring basis? Those are things that are being worked with innovations here on Earth right now, and are all of a sudden becoming crucial pieces of NASA architectures. And so we start to live in this in this area where the distinction between what's commercially relevant and what's NASA relevant is actually shrinking. There's that Venn diagram has more and more things in it as we go forward. And so we're in this situation where what is NASA relevant and what's commercially relevant is that intersection of those two things is larger than it ever has been before, but we still, in some cases, have mechanisms that are built that don't necessarily attract the entrepreneurs that are trying to address those markets. And so the purpose of the SBIR Ignite solicitation is is to go after those markets, those things that are both NASA relevant and commercially relevant, and to attract companies that may not be traditional SBIR companies. They may not be the people that were trying to develop tires for a Curiosity rover. They may be people that were trying to address communications from low Earth orbit, and all of a sudden NASA now wants to not necessarily fund a company to give them one niche technology for their one mission, but a capability to market that NASA can then use. And so as we start to think about the SBIR or NASA's responsibilities, not only for sending people to Mars or sending the James Webb Space Telescope out to take pictures of the universe, but also our responsibilities to stimulate emerging markets in both space and aeronautics, we start to realize that we're going to need to design mechanisms in a different way. And so the SBIR Ignite solicitation is really meant to break down some of the barriers that have existed in other that have kind of disincentivized entrepreneurial companies from engaging in the traditional SBIR solicitation in the past. And I want to be clear, the SBIR solicitation, the traditional one, has produced some amazing success stories. We will always need to have technology that will fit a very niche NASA need and go onto a mission that may or may not have a commercial market. And that is always going to be a part of what NASA needs to fund from an R&D perspective. But more and more, we are going to have a role to play, not only in our specific mission needs, but also in the emerging aerospace markets. And so in order to do that, we need to do some things. We need to really think a little differently. We need to think about what are the topics? What are the things that are the kind of lowest hanging fruit for things that are both NASA relevant and commercially relevant? How do we get companies that are trying to address these commercial markets to be interested in the SBIR program? So we're going to try to do things in this solicitation, such as lowering the barrier to entry, shorter proposal processes, solicitation requirements or proposal requirements that are more in line with what entrepreneurial companies come to expect in the world of private finance. And to this point, we've tried to do it all in one solicitation, and we've decided that in order to do it effectively, we need to actually have a solicitation that's built with different rules. And so, for example, proposals to the SBIR Ignite solicitation will unlike the traditional solicitation, will have a high level of scoring associated with the commercialization plan and the business model. So if you have a great technology, you have great expertise, but no path to market, you are going to face you're going to struggle in the evaluation process. Whereas if you have a pretty darn good idea, but you have a phenomenal business plan and a very clear path to market, that might not have fared so well in the traditional solicitation in the past, just due to the scoring of the proposals. Whereas here you would anticipate having a much easier time. We also want to think about the building the solicitation with the end goal in mind. So in the traditional solicitation, typically the people who fund a firm past phase 2 is a NASA project or another government agency's project, some type of program of record that says, okay, they've developed the tech to this point, now we want them in our mission, right? And so in this case, because NASA is not the only user of that technology, we shouldn't be the only funder of that technology either. We are fine to burn down the technical risk in the early stages of company development. But the goal really, at the end of the day, is to have the private sector come in and be the person who bridges the valley of death. So traditional solicitation, you're looking at usually what we call infusion projects and programs to pick up the funding and get companies to the next level. In the Ignite solicitation, we really want companies to be seeking out private investment in the early stages, pre-phase 1, during the phase 1, and during the phase 2 application process, so that you guys can convince us that after the SBIR money dries up, that you actually have a real path to market, more funding that's going to allow you to deliver capability to market. I do want to make sure that people are aware. Kind of a key element of the Ignite solicitation is the kind of the end goal of transitioning into what we call our post-phase 2 mechanisms in SBIR. And there are a few post-phase 2 mechanisms. One is the phase 2E, which is a matched funding mechanism up to, I believe, $350,000. And then the CCRPP, the Civilian Commercial Readiness Pilot Program, has in the past been a one-to-one matching program of $2.5 million. So that's $2.5 million of SBIR money matched with $2.5 million of investor technically it's just non-SBIR dollars. But in this, for Ignite, we're really targeting private investment to be the matching fund there. So in this scenario, we are looking for a company to, if possible, even decrease the period of performance for phase 2 from maybe 2 years to 1 year to try to really accelerate the pace of innovation, although that's not a firm requirement. But to try to accelerate the pace of innovation and possibly get from phase 1 to phase 2, getting about $1 million of investment from SBIR, then another $2.5 million through the CCRPP program, or possibly 375 through the phase 2E. And then another $2.5 million from the matched funding on the investor side. So in that timeline, you're looking at the possibility of, over the course of, let's say, 1.5 to 3 years, getting $6 million of total funding for a winner that's gone through the phase 2 program and taken advantage of all the post phase 2 mechanisms. So, I'm sorry. So the other thing that we're trying to do is we're trying to increase the likelihood of being funded in phase 2 for a company that has successfully completed milestones in phase 1. So what I mean by that is, if I'm not sure how many of the people tuning in here today are prior phase 1 award winners, but there is a thing that happens in SBIR programs, not just in NASA, but across federal agencies, where somebody is declared selectable but unfunded, meaning you met your technical milestones, your COR is happy with you, everybody's happy with you, but we just didn't have enough money to fund all the phase 2s. So some things got prioritized and some people got cut. We want to make sure that people, that if you've made your milestones and everything is good, that you have the ability to transition and go to phase 2. So we want to increase the certainty that we want to increase the pace of funding, but also the certainty that you will be getting funding. And that should hopefully make it easier for you to court investors on your side. So lower barrier to entry on proposals, higher weight of commercial viability, expedited review process, and reduced likelihood of selectable but unfunded proposals. Real interest on you showing commercial viability through potential to fund outside of the SBIR program beyond phase 2. And what we're really looking for as kind of some of the end results is new to NASA companies, new to SBIR companies, companies that are whose long-term revenue stream is not dependent on SBIRs, is not dependent even necessarily on NASA or the federal government. People whose business model is going to result in direct sales being what eventually supplies the company with recurring revenue. And we are going to be looking at metrics such as how many private investment dollars are flowing into our post phase 2 mechanisms or into our companies after they make it directly, even outside of SBIR. How much private sector investor money is going into those companies beyond phase 2. But at the end of the day, the goal is not to get company investment dollars. The goal is to get capability to market. So in the long run, we really are we will be judged not by how many investors engage the program or engage with the companies. We will be judged on, did the companies grow? Do they have more jobs? Are they providing more? Are they increasing their revenue? Are they increasing their valuations? Have they increased the number of jobs in America? Have they put America in a nice place competitively in emerging markets? And that's really, at the end of the day, what the program is about, is producing more high-growth, product-oriented companies that are funded in the early stages with SBIR dollars in a NASA-relevant field. And so the vision for Ignite is really to create this army of small businesses that can deliver capability into emerging markets, and that they can trace their early stage development, their early stage success, directly to investments that were made by NASA. And so with that, I hope I've given a little bit of information. I mean, the biggest question I always hear is, how is this different, right? And hopefully you guys have an idea But if there are other questions about differentiation from the traditional solicitation or other questions about SBIR Ignite, I am happy to answer them. One thing I did forget to mention is it is a pilot program. As a pilot program, it is going to start out relatively small. It is not going to be, it's not as if NASA is choosing to divide the traditional SBIR budget, which is, I believe, somewhere in the $200+ million range. Don't expect that size of an awards budget for SBIR Ignite in the pilot phase. But as if we do show success and we show that we can get really high quality startups addressing commercial markets, then there is the potential that the SBIR or the Ignite pilot effort could become a staple of the program and grow over time. So with that, Jen, I'm not sure if we have questions in the chat or anything else that I should be addressing for the group.
Hello. Yes, we do. A couple people now have asked about when will the solicitation go live?
Yes.
Once it is, where can they find it? Where will it be posted?
So yeah, there will be a number of ways to get to the solicitation. First things first. So there is on SAM.gov. If you search Ignite, there is a solicitation synopsis that is out right now, and that has a release date of July 12th. So we are planning on releasing the SBIR Ignite on July 12th. I'm sorry, the second part of that question, I've forgotten, Jen. What was it?
The question was, when will it go live? When will it be posted and where?
And where? So it will be posted on sbir.nasa.gov. It will also be available on sam.gov when the official solicitation hits. I will say that I believe it will be easier it will just be visually easier to look at at the sbir.nasa.gov website rather than the solicitations, government solicitations, including the Ignite solicitation, tend to be long. And if you're really just looking for, hey, does my topic fit? The best place to go for that initial information is going to be sbir.nasa.gov. I will say for questions, just to cut, I cannot talk about whether a specific company's technology is a good fit for a specific topic. If that's a question in the chat, that's just something that we can't address directly right now. So if the questions could be kept fairly applicable to the general audience, that would be preferable.
So here's a good one. What TRL level is this program aimed at?
So that's a good question. There is no strict TRL cutoff points for SBIR Ignite. However, I will say that in order to be able to convince somebody that you're going to address a commercial market on a timeline that's going to allow you to attract investment dollars that are going to kick in after your SBIR funding is over. You are going to have to. You don't have to be at any TRL, but you do have to show that your path is viable to get to an MVP on a timeline that is attractive to investors. So I don't want to say. I mean, I would say TRL 0, like, hey, it's in my head and it's warp drive and it probably is probably too low. But hey, if you figure out how to get your warp drive up and running in 5 years, and if you can convince us of it, let's go.
All right, so this next question from Josh, and I want to make sure I understand it. Is it possible to transition a phase 2 SBIR into a NASA phase 2? So I think what he's saying is from another program. So could I transition a phase 2 SBIR into a NASA phase 2 or phase 3 contract?
The quick answer to that is yes. All SBIR contracts are transferable across agencies. Now, to be clear, that effort is not Ignite specific. It wouldn't be something where the Ignite, what usually drives that is, if let's say you have a Space Force phase 2 that's been completed, and you think that there's a government customer at NASA that should be or could be interested in it, you usually have to convince that NASA program that it's viable, and then they would either fund it through a phase 3 through their project dollars specifically, or they would come to us as the SBIR program and say, hey, Space Force didn't choose this for a phase 2, but I really need it. Could you guys fund it with SBIR dollars for a phase 2? Either of those paths are possible. I will say it's more common for it to go the other way, where NASA has an unfunded one that Space Force ends up taking up, and I think that's just a function of the relative sizes of the SBIR portfolio budgets.
Great. Let's see, from Kai. Would you review the timeline again one more time for how long the review process takes through phase 1 and phase 2?
So that's actually a point that I did not bring up. So I don't want to give exact timelines. I don't want to go into this in strict detail, but I will say that as of right now, the SBIR program is not reauthorized for FY23, and that can cause problems with all SBIR schedules, not just NASA's, not Ignite, all of them, right? So I don't necessarily want to publicly commit to specific dates for that reason. But what I will say that we want to do that I didn't mention previously is that the phase 2s phase 2 proposals have to be submitted during the phase 1 period of performance for Ignite. And the purpose for that is to eliminate gaps in funding that exist between phase 1 and phase 2. We may not be able to eliminate them completely, but we want to be able to fund people, start funding people for phase 2 work as close to the end of their phase 1 period of performance as possible. And we believe that we can, by asking for the proposals on a shorter time scale and by expediting our own internal review process, we believe that we can dramatically close the gap compared to what some other agencies do.
Okay, so the next question is private investment documented through a letter of support? So I think there's some questions just about private investment and SBIR.
Yeah. So if you have, the short answer is proving to us that you have investors that would be willing to invest in you after the phase 2 is going to be part of how your commercialization plan is scored. There are other parts, right? But that letters of intent, letters of support are allowed, and and don't count against your page limits, which happens in some other in other solicitation mechanisms. But the short answer is we don't prescribe how you must show that. You just must make the case in the most compelling way you can. So if that's through letters of intent, if that's through letters of support, that's fine. I mean, if you say, I've been in, if a firm says, I've been in touch with VC investors, right? That's super vague and impossible to check up on, right? So that's probably not going to carry as much weight as somebody who has a stronger level of commitment through whatever mechanism you guys believe is your most effective way of telling that story.
All right, from Trevor. Is there a central location for all information on SBIR Ignite? What criteria determines the eligibility for a business to participate? Okay, so
SBIR.nasa.gov/Ignite will get you to the page that has all of the most current information about Ignite. Eligibility for SBIR Ignite is the same as eligibility for the typical SBIR program. Less than 500 employees, has to be US owned, cannot be more than 50% VC owned. So those requirements are the same. There's no strict requirement that you have or have not had an SBIR before. That's not a strict requirement. I will say that just the fact that we're changing the way that the proposals are scored will we hope change the types of companies that are selected, right? We want the mechanism to match the intent, but there's no strict eligibility requirements that say thou shalt not apply if.
Great. Another question from Kai. Does NASA retain march-in rights for any tech developed with an SBIR grant like NSF does?
I'm confused by that question because SBIR data rights essentially allow companies to hold on to their to the IP that's been generated through the SBIR grant or contract for, I believe, 20 years, if I'm not mistaken. I believe there are some government use clauses that are in there, but typically, what happens is if a company develops tech all the way to a usable TRL, that company's funded through a phase 3. The government doesn't say, okay, thanks, that's ours now. Now we're going to make the product ourselves. That's not a thing. So I'm not exactly sure what the complaint is about the NSF's specific policy, but I do think that I will say that one of the things that makes SBIR kind of attractive to a lot of firms that are trying to do spin out tech is the data rights that you get from an SBIR are much, much better than what you would get from a standard FAR-based contract. In a FAR-based contract, we pay for it, we own it, right? Unless we specifically say we don't want it. SBIR is different. And so it's different to the advantage of the small business.
Okay, I'm going to combine a few questions here. There's some questions around what type of software technologies could be funded, or how do we know what products and services the program is looking for? So I think you touched on that a little bit, but if you could explain again.
So on July 12th, the topics will be released, right? Those will be public as soon as the solicitation is released. I don't know if it's possible to release those a little sooner through the synopsis. I'll check into that and see if we can get that out. But it's got to be shared publicly at the same time. So there's not going to be any preferential phone calls that let anybody know ahead of time. But I will say, NASA doesn't keep secrets as to what they think is kind of low-hanging fruit for commercial aerospace. So there are other programs that look at these kinds of things. NASA iTech is one of them. Another one is ACO and Tipping Point, right? You can start to see some of those programs that are funding things that are specifically in the commercially relevant area. And so you can get some hints as to what NASA's general priorities are in commercial space, but that is not in any way an indication that these are going to be the specific topics asked for in Ignite. Waiting a couple weeks is the most effective way to figure out what's in there. As for the software specific question, it will be topic specific, but yes, software is allowed. So if you have a piece of software that you believe is going to be relevant to one of the topics that's released, then absolutely. It is not a hardware specific solicitation.
Great. So from William, is there a plan to use mechanisms similar to AFWERX's STRATFI or TACFI type of funding modifications?
Yeah, so I would say the CCRPP, the Civilian Commercial Readiness Pilot Program, is probably the closest thing that NASA has to the STRATFI, TACFI follow-on funding mechanisms. And I did go into that a little bit before, but that is what I would consider to be the kind of home run target for a company that enters into the SBIR Ignite program. If you get phase 1 and you get phase 2 and you have an investor lined up for post phase 2 and they can match 2.5 million to our 2.5 million, then you set yourself up for, our 2.5 million is, the 1 million in SBIR and the 2.5 for CCRPP are all non-dilutive. So, if you can get $6 million worth of work done for a $2.5 million, equity position only, and with 3.5 million of that being non-dilutive, I think that sounds like a pretty attractive deal for both the company and the investor.
Okay, from Christopher, and I just want to say thank you to this really engaged audience. We have a lot of questions coming in. What is the percentage of work breakdown for proposal between company employees and consultants or universities?
That is a good question, and I do not know the answer off the top of my head. So the STTR program and the SBIR program have different rules about that, and I don't recall the answer off the top of my head. I believe that, so universities can be subcontracted on SBIRs. That absolutely can happen. So, so if you have a university partnership, yes, you can have them on contract. As for the specific level of effort that has to be done in one organization versus the other, I'd have to get back to you on the number.
Okay. And going back to, we sort of answered this with the TRL question, but bringing it more into the startup language, are you looking for more early stage companies, or are you okay if the companies are a bit later stage in their development or their funding?
So yeah, again, I'm gonna say we don't have a strict requirement, right? So so the goal here is to get capability to market. I will say that we want the NASA investment to be meaningful. So you know, if there's a company that's already raised hundreds of millions of dollars, there may be a question of what's NASA's extra $1 million going to do for you? How is that going to help? But if you have a good answer for that, that's fine, right? So so that's the so yes, you can be later stage. That's perfectly fine. But you know, in general, my suspicion is that just because of the funding levels and the pace of the SBIR program, that more early stage startups are going to be attracted to the opportunity. But if you are a later stage startup and you have successfully raised funds and it is still an attractive opportunity for you, absolutely. I will say another issue that some late stage startups run into is that some of them end up being more than 50% VC owned. And at that point, you are ineligible for Ignite funding. So you've got to make sure your cap table allows it.
And likewise, so my company does nonprofit research for the purpose of global collaboration. Our product is the fruit of our research. How can I approach the solicitation from a nonprofit angle or perspective?
So SBIR in general only gives contracts to for-profit organizations, but depending on what your organization specifically does, I mean, I would say if you all are spinning out technologies to for-profit companies, or if you guys have portfolio companies that you assist, I would say that it's like we're not going to be able to probably give you an SBIR contract, where that's just not allowed through SBIR rules. But we could potentially still be a resource for you. So that's, I think, the most effective way that you could engage the program.
Going back to the funding, private funding. So can you address the relative magnitude of private funding and the scoring? So specifically capital already raised.
I cannot address the scoring prior to the solicitation release. So I cannot go into that, but I will say that the solicitation will have details on evaluation criteria, and because commercialization potential is going to be emphasized in the solicitation, we go into detail about what is required on that. I know it doesn't help that much, but I hope it helps a little.
And can you provide templates for application components to help standardize the content?
So that's a good question. We've kind of philosophically waffle on this. Should we standardize everything, or is it better to let kind of firms express themselves how they feel best, is most effective? Is it better to put everybody into the exact same box or not? I will say in the pilot, this is year one, this is the pilot activity for us. We do not necessarily have a kind of boilerplate format that we want. I mean, as in any SBIR, so the SBA policy directive mandates certain things that must be provided in every application. Or in every proposal, and the solicitation will have instructions on how we would like you to present that information to us, but it's not necessarily stamped out as this section should be this long, this section should address these three things and be this long. This section it's not it's not to that level.
Okay. And from Bill, we've seen DoD's new National Security Innovation Capital go from award to contract in 1 month. Are you hoping to move that fast, or will it be closer to a traditional SBIR?
From award to contract. So you're counting the number of days from the time we announce until the time the contract is signed. I don't know. I wish Carlos Torres, the program manager for SBIR, was on right now. He could probably. I believe the NASA SBIR program already meets that goal in the traditional solicitation. That might not be 100% accurate, but if we're not on that 30-day mark, we're pretty close to that 30-day mark. So, short answer is, in Ignite, we would expect to be as well. Yes. But I believe that NASA in general, in GSA audits, is usually the one getting patted on the back for speed between announcement and award. I don't believe that's as big an issue for NASA as it is for some other agencies.
Okay, from Ricardo, can a TR6 participate? I'm guessing that's TRL level 6.
Yeah, I don't know what TR6. I mean, if you're TRL 6, I would say yes. The one issue that you do run into is that the SBIR program is not a procurement. It is a development of technology, innovative technology. So what we are funding has to be advancing the technology in some way. So if you're saying, I've got a product, you should use SBIR to buy it from me, that is explicitly not allowed by any agency for SBIR. It has to be that has to go through a standard procurement mechanism. So the SBIR program is meant to fund innovative technology. In some cases, it's sufficiently innovative to say, hey, I've got a commercial product, but if NASA ever wants to use it, I can't use it in its current state. I have to modify it. I have to change it. And that could be an innovation potentially that's substantial enough to get SBIR funding. So I would say the later TRL you are, the more at risk you are of not being sufficiently innovative. Like if you're in the 8-9 range, but but if you're TRL 6, I mean, that first of all, there's plenty of work to be done to get from TRL 6 to TRL 8. So there's no issue with that. But also, even if you're TRL 8, it doesn't necessarily mean you're TRL 8 for everyone's use case.
From Monique, will the Ignite program offer both STTR and SBIR options?
Not in the pilot year, not this year.
Okay. Where is the SBIR internship location? I'm not sure if you meant internship or if you meant the solicitation location. Let's go with solicitation location.
The solicitation will be on sam.gov, but I mentioned, I think the easiest way to see the solicitation is going to be going to sbir.nasa.gov, and it should be readily available on, I don't know which portion of the website it's going to be on, but it should be it should be very easy to find on sbir.nasa.gov when it opens.
And I think Allie mentioned for everyone in the chat rooms, if you put your email address, she's collecting them and we'll add you to the email list, and we'll be sending out emails and letting people know when the solicitation is posted. Let's see. How long will the solicitation remain open?
So I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say that before the solicitation opens, but I will say this. R&D proposals, solicitations, have to be open for a minimum of 45 days, and we are trying to expedite our processes to the maximum extent possible.
Great. All right, the questions in the chat are slowing down. I'm just going to go to a few that we had received previously. Let's see. My technology is specifically designed for earthbound problems. How can I translate it to aerospace?
Well, so one thing that I didn't maybe mention previously, which maybe I should have, is that in the Ignite solicitation, there's no requirement that it solve an aerospace problem. Okay, so NASA doesn't necessarily have to be a customer at all. So, for example, NASA has some responsibilities to develop technology and make sure that the data that NASA collects becomes as valuable as possible to people here on Earth. So, in some cases, a solution that helps people here on Earth, if it is still NASA relevant, whatever that means, right? You'd have to see the topic to figure out exactly, is it tied to NASA data sources? Is it tied to some mission that NASA has in Earth observation? How is it used? So you don't necessarily have to, you might not necessarily have to pivot, right? But in general, I guess it depends on the specific technology area, but if you, I think that there will be more and more overlap between things that are terrestrially relevant and things that are NASA relevant as the missions become more ambitious. And so I don't necessarily know that pivoting away from your Earthbound market into a niche aero market may not be the best strategic thing for you. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I don't want to give you business advice, but my hope would be that one of the hopes of the Ignite solicitation is that people don't have to pivot as hard as they do in order to satisfy the niche technology asks that come from from some of the more specific topics in other agency solicitations, and in some cases the traditional NASA solicitation.
Okay, and I think this might be our last question. Are there requirements for the team composition? Do you need co-founders? I'm a solo founder.
So no, there are no requirements. You have to be able to, SBA has specific criteria that you have to meet, right? If you can convince everybody that you have a great path to market, that your team is viable, that you have a work plan, and that you have technical viability, those are all the things that we're, if you yourself can do that, then there's no issues. So, but you have to be able to effectively make that case.
And I think that's it. Oh, there's one last question. We'll throw this one in, and then there's a lot of questions about if the session is being recorded. But one more question: will there be an open topic or only specific solicitation topics, or both?
The topics, there will be specific topics. So do not anticipate an open topic for any and all commercializable tech. As for recording, this session is being recorded. And it will be posted, I believe, at least to the NASA-itech.org site, but I believe also to the sbir.nasa.gov site, the sbir.nasa.gov/ignite site. So this should live publicly and be available to any other founders that you think may be interested in it, any other accelerators, investors. If there are people that are in your circles that are kind of saying, you think would be excited about a new opportunity, non-dilutive funding opportunity from NASA, then yeah, give them the word. I believe it's going to take us a little time to edit and get the thing posted and get it up. So give us a little bit of time, but it should be up there fairly soon. All right. Well, I just want to thank everybody who tuned in live, and for anybody who's watching this online, that's the end of the show. Hopefully you got some questions answered. We will be having a second webinar after the solicitation releases, tentatively scheduled for July 13th. If you have additional questions, feel free to ask them at that session. And I wish you all luck in your endeavors, especially if they end up advancing commercial markets, aeronautics markets, and delivering capability to emerging space and emerging aero.